I'm Bruce Purdy. This is the second in a series of discussions about my time and work in the developing world. And the first time we talked a bit about the whole idea of foreign aid and its value creation. We talked about several different countries that I worked in, those being Albania, Liberia, and my 3 years in Lebanon. So today, we're going to continue a discussion that we started about Central and Eastern Europe. I'm just going to try to finish that conversation and then move on to the Middle East, to Afghanistan, and hopefully some more discussion about some interesting journeys I've had and some memorable moments that I've had in my 44 years of working and living abroad. So, are there any questions from the last session that I missed that anybody has before we begin today?
Yeah, do you never get really frustrated when you go to a country, you do work, you write a report, and then you never get nothing much gets in?
Never, absolutely never. Never happened.
Yeah, well, could you talk a bit about that?
I'm actually going to talk about that a bit.
Good.
In the latter part, if you don't mind. That's kind of my ending spiel, if that's okay with you. But no, I would never have gotten frustrated. None of this work is frustrating at all. It's absolutely just a piece of cake. Where we left off was we were talking about my work at the Urban Institute. My work at the Urban Institute in Central and Eastern Europe, and mostly my work in Poland, where I spent most of my time. I think I mentioned I made 33 trips to Poland over 3.5 years. So I was not living there, but commuting back and forth. So I was constantly going back and forth, as Barrett knows, who's sitting right here. And I was there during the time that Lech Walesa was president. He had been, of course, a trade union representative and became president in 1990 and 1994. Basically, what the Urban Institute had been asked to do was to lead the non-military capacity building in Central and Eastern Europe, and we were headquartered in Warsaw. We also worked in several other countries, doing essentially the same kind of work.
Bruce, could you just tell me, I forget, what organization sponsored your trips?
This was a combined effort by USAID, and we were also funded by the World Bank, and there was some EU money as well. It all sort of came together in a 4-year package. We were doing work in public sector financing and urban local government, economic development, planning, infrastructure development. There was a wide range of activities, and we were the prime contractor, and we hired a bunch of other firms, including Harvard University and others, to do work for us and with us. It was an extraordinarily rewarding time, to be honest with you. There's a picture of my street that I lived on. I was in Poland in 1993. A little dreary. It kind of looks like this. Yes.
Were you bidding on those contracts, or were you straight out awarded those contracts? Were you competing against
Oh, we were
other
competing.
companies?
We were competing. The Urban Institute had a fairly decent reputation. I was with them. I was the co-director of the International Center, and we had a fairly reputable reputation doing this kind of work. So we had won this very large contract, and we're in the process of retaining many subcontractors to help us. As I said, Harvard University, the Research Triangle Institute in North Carolina, and others were subcontractors to us.
You know what, in that picture, what strikes me? No color.
No color. It's drab. It kind of looked like the last couple of days here. This, as I mentioned, is the first McDonald's that was started in Warsaw, and that's a picture of people lining up and new private sector development in the country. But before I begin, I should really move back a bit. But I believe that the work we did really created the conditions for some democratic governance in that part of the world. It's interesting, I was talking to someone the other day that didn't know what the kind of work we had done. And I looked it up recently, and the Wall Street Journal just recently reported that basically 50% of Americans don't remember this turnover from a communist society to a supposedly democratic society. The transformation really was not from planned economies to market economies. It's something that people today really don't remember. But in many respects, I believe that we were sort of a small Marshall Plan. We fostered small and medium enterprises. We established public financing systems. We worked with urban areas to train mayors in how to run these rather large and impressive cities and the importance of urban leadership. And I believe that the region as a whole has undergone a real transformation from what it was, an incredibly rapid transformation. They've really overcome tremendous social and economic odds and undertaken many structural reforms. But not everything is rosy. Persistent corruption, I believe, political stagnation, and significant poverty still exists in parts of Central and Eastern Europe. But the good news story is 11 of the countries that were on some sort of aid in the Central and European areas are no longer on foreign aid. They are no longer beneficiaries of any sort of aid. So they were at once all on aid. Now we have 11 countries off of aid. The interesting country in the whole area that I did not work in was Hungary. And we did not have a contract in Hungary at the time. And as we notice in the recent publications in newspapers, Viktor Orban has taken over in sort of one-man rule. He goes against the grain in what's going on in Central and Eastern Europe today. And he used coronavirus as a tool to pass sweeping legislation that made him a one-man rule, a dictatorship. He rules by decree. His friends are in Ankara, Beijing, and Caracas. He really canceled countries' elections, and there was 8-year prison terms for breaking quarantine during coronavirus. He gave himself power to shut down media outlets, and he's argued that globalization has weakened the individual state. And we hear that to some extent in our own politics today.
And he's very close to Putin as well.
Very close to Putin and several others that we may talk about as well. But he is the exception. The point that I want to make is that 11 countries who were on aid are now off aid, and they are now dispersing aid, as we know, to Ukraine. So, I found that period of my life, 6 years of back and forth in Central and Eastern Europe, perhaps one of the most profound experiences one could have. And I am just thrilled that I had the opportunity to do it. Let's talk about my second favorite country outside Poland, and that is Jordan. Like Poland, I have been in and out of Jordan for years. And it all sort of focuses on the whole issue of water and the lack thereof in the country. Jordan water became sort of a specialty of mine. Water resources management. It is the second water-poorest country in the world, behind Namibia. As I said, I've been in and out of the country for perhaps 10 years. It's also been my most recent trip. And what I was doing there, because King Abdullah saw the need to increase water to his citizens. He has about 11 million citizens in the country. About 43%, they have resources to supply water to about 43% of the population. The remaining population is in need of water. So King Abdullah, about 10 years ago, decided that his country was on the Gulf of Aqaba, the southern part of the country, and that he could desalinate water from the Gulf and bring it north 280 miles or 460 kilometers to Oman. So he decided to put a contract out to plan, design, finance, and construct a desalination plant on the Gulf of Aqaba. And he hired the Urban Institute to come in and figure out what needed to be done and what it was going to cost to produce that desalination plant. And I was asked to go over and run that project. So I went to Amman and met the king and the minister of water, and we talked about the project. And the first thing he wanted me to do was to go to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, to meet with his sister, who was married into the bin Laden family. He was asking the Saudis for $1 billion. The project we estimated was 1.8 billion. We had received 400 million from the World Bank, so we were shy of roughly 1.4 billion, and he was asking his sister for $1 billion. No big deal. The morning I was to fly from Amman to Jeddah, I woke up at 4 o'clock. I brushed my teeth and collapsed. I don't know what happened to me, but I was passed out for probably half an hour. And I crawled. There was nobody. I was on the top floor of the Hyatt Hotel in Amman. And I crawled to the elevator and was able to push the button. And I went down to the 30 flights or whatever to the first floor and screamed help. And I was rushed to the King's Hospital. I was working directly for the King at the time. And I don't remember anything beyond the next 24 hours, outside of the fact that I woke up in the King's Hospital, 14-bed hospital. And standing above me was a really handsome young guy saying, "Hey, who are you?" And I said, "I'm here." He said, "You've had a rather difficult problem to solve." And I said, "What?" And I was really out of it. Come to find out, I had a very degenerative heart disease. I have a very rare heart problem. And interestingly enough, it's a side story, of course, but I never got to Jeddah. But the story goes that this young guy was standing above me in a cough shirt and a pair of khakis and a pair of Bass Fusions, and I thought, where the hell am I? I'm not in Amman. And he had trained at the Baby Heart Institute in Houston, and he was the King's cardiologist. And he saved my life. And I was then medevaced to Boston on Swissair, at which time I had 2 heart patients. And but the bottom line was, it was a remarkable time. I never got to finish the project because of my condition, but that's my story about having to try to go to meet with the King's sister in Jeddah. And I never got to do it, and I always wanted to do it. My damn heart gave out.
It seems to me that not only was this very ambitious project,
Yes.
because it had to transport the
They
water.
transported
Like, but what I mean, it makes sense because the Middle East needs water and then you have all that. What, how did it end up? Was it a successful project
It's in the works right now.
in the works? So would that be a model for the rest of the Middle East?
Well, it's interesting. They went ahead. So I just want to, I'm going to answer your question, but basically there's a water scarce region, as everyone knows, and all the wars, the 1984 Arab-Israeli War, the Six-Day War, the Syrian conflict, the Gulf War, doesn't help. Trying to negotiate water rights in the Middle East. That's right outside of Petra. This is the scheme. So you see here a picture of the Gulf of Aqaba and water being transported north, roughly 460 kilometers to Amman. And Jody, to answer your question, the project went forward. It is Israeli technology. The Jordanians are using Technion University as their technology, and it's being built by the Saudis. It's a Saudi construction company, and it is under construction. And they are all, what happened is they are importing water also from the Red Sea over to the Gulf of Aqaba, combining the water and pushing it forward. And it will be completed in 2024. And it is totally financed in public-private partnership with the Bin Laden family and the World Bank.
And the desalination,
Desalination,
where is that occurring in Oman or?
no, it's occurring in the Gulf of Aqaba. The desalination plant is on the
Right
Gulf,
there.
and then they take
You know, it's taking me a while, but it's upside down, and
Yeah.
I'm not used to that.
Yeah, that's a lousy picture, by the way. I actually have some better pictures, but yeah, but this has helped solve not only the Jordanian problem, I would argue, but also the water rights issue in the Middle East.
Right.
Because during the, and I'm going to get to this in a minute, water is the issue of water is part of the war that's going on, as we all know, in the Middle East.
Just a question, how much more expensive is that water as compared to what we pay for water?
It's very expensive water because of the desalination plant, but it's subsidized by the government, and it is water. Pricing of water in Jordan depends on where you are. If you're in Amman, it's cheaper, but if you're in the smaller villages, it's actually more expensive, which seems ass backwards to me, but that's what happens. So they have, the Jordanians have most of their water coming from the Jordan River and the Yarmouk River, and they share water with Israel and Syria, and Jordan is the last one downstream to receive the water, and the Syrians now are really stopping any water to flow into Jordan. But the project, the desalination project, has increased the water supply to Jordanian populations by 25%. Again, that's just this. It provides roughly 25% of the drinking water. It was supposed to be completed in 2017. Because of political and financial issues, it is really now being constructed and will come online in 2024. Under the peace accords, under the Oslo peace accords, Jordan receives the remaining water, not most of its remaining water from Israel, though some from Syria, as I said. Because of everything that's gone on, Jordanians receive perhaps better water supply than just about any other country in the Middle East. And King Abdullah, it says, outside of keeping peace with his neighbors, it is his number one priority. He, by the way, is a fascinating character. When I first met him, I have a great story. I was in a receiving line at a black tie event. I was introduced to him. He said, oh, hello, you're the guy that's heading up the desalination project. And I said, yes. And he introduced me to his wife, Queen Rania. And I said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Boston. He said, well, I went to Deerfield Academy. And I said, Deerfield. I said, yeah, I know Deerfield. I didn't go there, but I certainly know it. And he said, yeah, and then I went to BU, went to Boston University. And I said, I went to BU? He said, yeah. He said, I flunked out. He said, I was a bartender at Division 16 there? The bar up on Boston Street. I was a bartender at Division 16. My dad got insane, got really ticked off at me and sent me to the British military school, where I learned to be a jet fighter pilot. And he became head of the Jordanian Air Force. But he was a party boy. And he said, he was never meant to be king. It's a long story. He was never meant to be king, but it worked out that he was. And he said, where'd you live in Boston? I said, we lived on the corner of Commonwealth and Fairfield. He said, oh, you're the house with the turret. I said, yeah. I said, I walk by that all the time. He said, well, I live right behind you on Beacon Street. And he just turned out to be the most interesting, entertaining, and a wonderful human being. And raised a great family. He sent all his kids to school in Boston. He loves Boston, so we shared that. He loves Boston and the Red Sox. So he was a really cool guy to deal with. The country, though, is still receiving a lot of foreign aid. About 30% of the water financing in the country still comes from the World Bank, the EU, and particularly the EU. The EU is there in droves. I'm going to go back a minute. I also want to tell you about something else I got involved in, which is again, at the Urban Institute. In 1995, the Oslo Accords were going on, and there were meetings being held all over the Middle East about various issues. And the Urban Institute was once again hired to sort of facilitate meetings between the Israelis and the Palestinians over the issue of water rights. And this gentleman, Jeff Togarski, and I were asked to go over and to be facilitators of these meetings. Just a team meeting. And I thought, oh crap, we're getting involved in the Oslo Accords. They were dealing with the issues of who was owning the water in the Jordan River Valley, the mountains and the coastal aquifers. And I was sent over and I was talking to our client, who was the European Union. And I said, well, I'm going to go in and facilitate this. How do I do this? And he said, well, you'll find out once you get in there. And so I went in, and the Israelis were sitting on one side, and the Palestinians were walked in, and the Israelis turned their backs like this and wouldn't deal with them. But they went flat. And I said, listen, we're going to have this meeting. We got to get and talk. And I spent most of my time being I don't know what it was, but I ended up having them have some conversation. But this is one of about 50 or 60 meetings that were going on to pull together this whole idea of the Oslo Accords. The bottom line is the Israelis control the water going into the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Water, the PWA, the Palestinian Water Authority, to this day really has no say on what the issue is regarding water. The problem still exists today, and the Palestinian Water Authority has been denied, since 1995, has been denied any access to the wells and to the water rights that they own. They are controlled completely by Israel. So the problem still exists, but is getting better because Jordan is kind of out of the picture because now they have the desalination plant. But the whole West Bank and Gaza and Jordanian Israeli water situation is way too complicated to even discuss here, but it's fascinating, and I got to see some of it in a very small way. It was a really big part of my world. Okay, I'll spend a little time on this. I was with Deloitte Consulting. I was a managing partner at Deloitte Consulting in 2008, when Obama was in charge. And we were asked to go over, and I was asked to run a program, which seems ludicrous right now, but I was asked to needless to say, I ended up in Afghanistan on 2 different trips, roughly 5 months in Afghanistan. My first trip in there, I was in my Brooks Brothers suit and my Coleman loafers and my very expensive luggage. And I went in on a military transport plane out of Abu Dhabi with a bunch of 17 and 18-year-old, primarily African-American kids who didn't know anything about war. Were being shipped over there, and I felt like a complete idiot being on this plane with them. I was the only white guy, I think, in the transport plane. And to this day, I think about those kids and how they were sent over, and they had no idea where New York City was, let alone where Afghanistan was. And we were flown into Kabul, and they ended up going one place, and I ended up going to the embassy and having a great suite in the embassy. And I've often thought of them. It's what happened to so many of those young men. And I looked like a ridiculous idiot, all dressed up, and they were scared to death. They had no idea what was happening to them. So I was asked to go in. Deloitte was asked to go in, as we were a big consulting firm, one of the largest in the country, to go in and to assess the development aid by the Obama team. What did that mean? And the belief was by the Obama administration that reconstruction aid to Afghanistan could remain mired in the same poverty and chaos that gave rise to the Taliban if we didn't understand what was happening to the aid and what the Afghans wanted out of it. And when I look back now at that assignment, I think, why did I ever take it? Oops. Well, picture didn't work, but this is kind of the world we lived in. I was the only time in my, well, there in Zimbabwe, but the only time in my life I was truly frightened. So I was asked to go in, and the contract was vague, and it said, figure out what they're going to need for reconstruction. What types of resources should we provide? Remember, this is 2008. Obama's trying to figure out what the hell to do. Should the aid be that we give this country be distributed via central government, or should we go to the regional governments and give them aid for their particular specific projects? Based on the interviews my team collected with hundreds and hundreds of people, both in the provinces and in the capital, we thought that 25% of the aid should be used for food, housing, medical care, 25% for rebuilding infrastructure, 15 to 20% for education. These are the figures we came up with. I mean, I don't even know where we got these figures because it was so chaotic. 5 to 10% for government and 10 to 15% for agriculture. Security. The annual aid budget that Obama put in place at the time was 1.5 to 5 billion, depending on the year. So I'm going to tell you a story about why I think this is all crazy. So I was asked by the ambassador to go to Helmand province. And so while I was there, I had 4 Nepalese guards, one in front, one in the back, and 2 on either side. Now, the Nepalese are some of the toughest people in the world. And they were guarding me every day while I was in country. And I couldn't move without them. In fact, they told me to take 4 steps forward, 4 steps back. They would look out, and they had these Kalashnikov rifles the whole time looking for folks. And so I went with my team in a U.S. Marine helicopter out to Helmand province. And I met with the provincial government. And that was one of my trips, to go meet, to talk about, what do you need? What do you need? Well, we need everything. You live in the 14th century. What do we need? And so I entered the provincial government, and I stood up and gave my spiel against my really nice suit and my Kohan briefcase, and looking all very professional. There was dead silence on the part of the government, provincial government. And I'm dealing with these gentlemen with large beards and in robes. And my guards are standing on either side of me to protect me. And the gentleman who runs the provincial government came up to me and stared at me and said, in English, you know, when the Russians came through here, I slit the throats of 200 Russian young military men personally. And if you don't leave this tent right now, I'm going to slit your throat. Suffice to say, the Marines didn't like to hear that, and the Nepalese guards protected me. But it's the only time I was frightened for my life. I never met the gentleman again, but that assignment in Afghanistan basically sent me into retirement. I was petrified. My argument to the World Bank and the EU and others was that aid can be very easily wasted if the recipient governments do not create conducive economic and legal environments, and none of that occurred in Afghanistan. To me, it was a failed state, and it was going to be a failed state. And my arguments didn't hold. I chose not to go back, even though I was asked. I was too frightened. And my husband Barrett said, if you go back, I'm leaving. I want to go back to Jordan. Again, favorite country. So my last assignment was, again, it was a joint USAID, European Union, World Bank assignment, and it was to look at the Syrian refugee crisis that was occurring at the time in Jordan. Now, just have some. Bear with me for a minute. I'll get this.
I ask a question.
Yes.
When this gentleman came up to you and said,
Yeah.
if you don't leave this tent or whatever it was, I'm going to slit your throat.
Yeah.
Were you tempted to say, come on, pal, let's go have a cup of coffee and explain to me?
Hell no.
Well, I think I would have done, and I'd said, why do you want to slit my throat?
Well, he didn't like the American or any presence in his country, I suspect.
Okay.
He was a very respected individual. In fact, he was involved in many of the peace negotiations. He just didn't want anything to do with me. And I didn't want anything. By then, I was unhappy with my assignment. I think it was one of the few times that I feel like we didn't create any goodwill.
It just seemed like a hell of an opportunity to find out what.
Well, other people could find out. I was too frightened. I'm going to be candid. I didn't particularly want to be there. So here we have, Jordan, Syria to the north, southern border of Syria attached to the northern border of Jordan. Syrian civil war begins in 2011. Mass exodus out of the country of Syria. 750,000 Syrians cross the Jordanian border. They come to the northern, very desert, hot, dry area of northern Jordan. And they create a camp. And here's the camp. Here's a picture of the camp. Many dispersed throughout the country, but this particular camp, which is called Zatari, is made up of 80, well now they say, when I was there, it was 80,000 refugees, 50,000 children, a group of individuals with no citizenship, no passport. 10% were working. My job as team leader, as the chief of the party, was to figure out and help the government of Jordan figure out what the hell to do with an increase of 750,000 people into their country. Remember, there's 11 million people in Jordan. There's only 2.4 actual Jordanians, as they call them. It is primarily a state of refugees. There's the camp. In shacks and lacking water, lacking waste recycling, lacking education. A lot of NGOs are there, Mercy Corps, Save the Children, everybody trying to help out. But it's an incredible mass migration all at once into a very poor country. You can imagine what the king and his ministers were thinking. They were seeking help from anybody they could. They were digging wells for water, trying to produce water, because as we said before, it's a water shortage country. And this was the largest network of water systems put together in 3 years of any place in the world. It was put together by the European Union, digging wells and trying to produce water for this mass migration. So the question was asked, what can be done about the Syrians coming into Jordan? It's the second, as I said, the second largest refugee camp in the world. It's now Jordan's 4th largest city. They count for basically, now some people are arguing 10% of the total population, again, of Jordan. These are just facts. It's about the size of Memphis, Tennessee.
I have a question. Do the refugees, the children that are born there, the anchor babies, do they become citizens?
They do. According to a decree by the king in 2018, I was there in 2019. Yeah, they are assimilating like the rest of the populations, the Palestinians, Lebanese, I mean, you name it. Jordan's a cauldron of refugees. The Bedouin population, when King Hussein took over, the Bedouin population was 2.4 million, and now his son has got 11 million people in a very small country, surrounded by enemies. Only 10% of the population when I was there, I don't know what it is now, provided work permits. It's about 10 miles from a city, a very popular city in Jordan called Mafraq. Again, now they're saying that 1.8 million, now the figure is 1.8 million Syrians have crossed over since the Civil War. 13,000 Syrians a day are pouring across the border into Jordan. The impact on the northern cities, particularly Mafraq, on water, food shortage, education, you name it. It is a crisis. There's another picture we took of the refugee camp.
It seems like the diseases would be rampant in a
area like that?
Yeah. Interesting you point that out. It's another story. I mean, I was on a plane to Amman from London, and this guy sitting next to me was was the dean of the medical school at Vanderbilt. And he was going over to see the situation with respect to a public health issue. And we were talking about it because we both headed to the same place, and we took a car up to Mafrik, and he was talking about how he was going to rally the medical community because nobody was paying attention to it, and he was going to rally the medical community to come into Zatari and to help out. And he was thinking of having his second or third year medical students required to spend a month working in the camps to get some indication of how fortunate they are in this country, to get a sense of the future, of what they might be doing. I don't know how that ever came about, but he was a pretty cool guy. He was a new young dean at a medical school, and he just heard about this problem and was making his moves over to northern Jordan.
Chris, who would have financed him in that project?
I think he would have done it himself, or he would have started it himself and then sought money from USAID or the bank or some other international institution. But he had read some article or heard a speech by Abdullah or something where it just got under his claw. And he said, we have to do something. And maybe as a medical school, I can garner other medical schools and get together and we can go do something of value, some value creation over this whole issue. But it was a pretty bleak situation.
Well, who supplies the food and how does it get there?
That's a great question. I mean, it was all kinds of, there must be 100 NGOs, non-governmental organizations, working in the area, plus the Jordanian government. The problem was the Jordanian government doesn't have the money to support this. They're not a rich country. And so I'd say it's a combination of World Hunger and other NGOs helping out with the food supply, as well as public health. I mean, it's being run by NGOs. It was when I was there. The non-governmental organizations were clearly supporting it. In terms of the international organizations, by far and away, the EU was the largest provider of funds, and the Nordic countries, the Norwegians, the Swedes, the Danish, were the biggest supplier of people and supplies to the camps.
But the NGOs get government money. That's
They get
a
government
lot.
money, right? They get government money, sure.
Can they build anything there?
No, it's not particularly. What they were doing the Norwegians were starting to build greenhouses so that they could have, many of the women couldn't get work permits. So the last I remember was that the Norwegian embassy was trying to get money and build a series of greenhouses on the edge of the camp so that they could grow food. And that's the last. I haven't been involved since, but this is a picture that we took. We did a flyover of the camp, and it's just, think about humanity and how it lives in various parts of the world. So this was my last assignment before I sort of somewhat kind of retired. Again, my job was to figure out infrastructure needs, water, and I was to report to the government. And the impact on the surrounding, there's a primary and secondary impact that of course occurs on the surrounding villages and towns. The Jordanians themselves felt very vulnerable. All of a sudden, the northern part of the country, extraordinarily poor to begin with, is now laced with lots of very a new population that didn't exist several years ago. But the king, being a remarkable human being, I believe, was really determined to build a framework to respond to the crisis and work closely, particularly with the EU, to solve this problem. And they're still working on it. It's still a work in progress today. We've got 1.8 million additional citizens in a water shortage and very poor country to begin with. Again, in our report, and as we said, it's highly likely the Syrians will stay in Jordan. They will never return home. I was highlighting the water situation at the time, which was apparent long before the arrival of the refugees. This was the water poorest part of the country to begin with, and then you add 750,000 people, and you get a whole different situation. So again, I just want to reiterate that it is a country of refugees, Palestinians, Iraqis, Lebanese, Syrians, and others. But it's my favorite, it's my second favorite country. I love it. I don't know why I love it. I love the desert. I just think what the king has done, an ability to bring together multiple cultures and to create a new country. And that's what he's doing on a daily basis, because he himself is a Bedouin, calls himself a Bedouin. But he's got all these other folks he has to wrestle with every day, and they all come from very different cultures. And of course, in the other city up in the north is Irbid. So Irbid and Mafraq, the water supply continues to decrease by 40%, and this is what we were dealing with, and that's why we brought in contractors to rebuild, to build wells and to drill for wells and to try to solve the water problem, which was the problem at the time. And that this is just an estimation that by 2030, water demand will double if the refugees stay in Jordan. And again, it's a huge crisis for a very small country. But think about the refugee camp being the size of Memphis, Tennessee. It just happens overnight.
Isn't this happening globally?
Yeah.
I mean, I think of Africa for one, but this is something
Ethiopia.
that the world.
This is a microcosm of what's going on around the
And
world.
what's about to continue to happen.
Right.
Do you think Abdullah have any successors or the people that are around him to help support?
He's got 4 children. His oldest son, as I said, he was never meant to be king. His uncle was meant to be king. When King Hussein had a massive heart problem as well. 15 years ago, King Hussein packs up from Amman, goes to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. His brother believes that the king is never going to come home. He's going to die. So his brother and his sister-in-law move everything out of the palace, and they move in. They basically take charge of the palace. King Hussein has an operation in the Mayo. He survives. He hears what his brother did. He kicks his brother out of the country. Lock, stock, and barrel. His brother, his sister-in-law, and all their kids get tossed out of the country, and he loses his status, and he moves to London. King Hussein then says, I gotta have a successor. Well, I've got this playboy, oldest son, called Abdullah, having a great time in London with his Kuwaiti girlfriend. I gotta get them straight. And what happens is, he summons Abdullah, who's at the Air Force Academy in London, in England. And he says, pull your act together, you're going to be king. You are my successor. So he marries Miss Kuwait. His father was the Kuwaiti ambassador to England. She is a beauty. She is lovely. And he comes home and becomes king. He never wanted to become king. Doesn't particularly like the role, but he played it. To answer your question, he's had 4 children. His oldest son is 24 now, graduated from Harvard and is now in the law school. His daughter just got engaged last week to a Saudi Arabia venture capitalist figure. And his sister's married in the Osama bin Laden family, so, whatever. But yes, his successor is being trained to be the next king. And he too is getting married this summer. So everything's being put in place, but he has been a remarkable stabilizing force in a region that is in complete turmoil constantly.
Bruce? My understanding was that Queen Noor, who was the American, who married Hussein, was really pushing for their oldest son to be the successor. And every once in a while, a story about him will come up that he's still sort of claiming he has a claim to
He claims right. He claims he's the heir to the throne because Noor had 4 sons as well, had 4 sons. And, she was the daughter of, what airline? Pan Am. She was, that was an arranged marriage between Hussein and Noor. Abdullah is the daughter of a British flight attendant. Hussein was taking a trip so the current king's mom was a British flight attendant. Hussein was taking a trip, King Hussein, from London to Amman, and he fell in love with his flight attendant. And so he had several children from several different wives. But the current king's mom was British, and she was killed in a plane crash when he was 3. So he never really knew his mother, and he was raised by several other of Hussein's wives.
So he's the firstborn?
He's the firstborn of,
male.
and he's the one that was chosen. And he was, from all indications, and when you meet him, first of all, his English is great, and he swears like a trooper. But he went to Deerfield. He was at Deerfield for five years, Deerfield Academy in Massachusetts, and he's just a remarkable figure. At Deerfield, he was the roommate of a right-wing talk show host in Boston called Howie Carr. And they are best friends. But then he did flunk out first semester of BU. He never even made it by the first semester. He flunked everything. And he admits it, he hated going to college. He loved being a party animal. But he's turned out to be a remarkable human being. And I had the good fortune of knowing him. So, I'd like to spend a little time talking about, we talked about 8 countries in general now. So I was a kid from the suburbs of World War II. So I was as American as apple pie, and it's taken me a long time to feel at home with people from different cultures and different countries. And I admit to that. Building trust oftentimes takes time. And seeing poverty, because I work primarily in conflict and post-conflict situations, seeing poverty on a consistent basis can take its toll on you. And you wonder how people live, and it makes you begin to think about your own milieu and your own survival. And we really learn that everybody on this planet really wants the same thing. They want health, they want home, they want families. It was certainly, the question was asked, it's certainly sometimes difficult to be objective in some of these situations, and you really need to rely more on collecting objective qualitative data and sometimes quantitative data to look at situations objectively. I guess I learned to always expect the unexpected, and there was oftentimes real conflict on the ground. I'm not painting a rosy picture here. I'm suggesting that sometimes it was difficult. There was a lot of conflict between the teams on the ground and the clients. And the client was either who was paying you, the Development Bank or the World Bank or USAID, or the country or the individuals that you were working with. Conflict was inevitable because you were having everybody had a different opinion on what needed to be done. And there were always sort of different objectives among consultants and local officials about what really needs to be done, how and when. And solving that conflict was really a good part of the job. Trying to get some sort of consensus around what we can do with the monies or the time that we've been allocated. So I like this, don't be the consultant that borrows your watch and tells you what time it is. But don't fall into the innovation trap either, that everything has to be innovative and creative. I saw that a lot. I certainly tried to work in partnership with the funding client as well as the client on the ground. And oftentimes, no matter whether they signed agreements or not, there was conflict between the UN or the World Bank or the USAID representatives and our client, a minister, a mayor, a deputy mayor, wherever we were working. And trying to, again, deal with that conflict was the problem. I always think, well, be realistic about what you don't know, because we were oftentimes parachuted into cultures which we really didn't perhaps understand. And we, being Americans, sometimes some of my team members would think, well, this is the way we need to do it because we're Americans, and that's not always the case. And again, I tried to it was easy to become frustrated with the culture you're working in and face the prejudices or negative cultural stereotypes that you may have of a particular culture. And I found that particularly when I was working in Liberia, when I had a bunch of upper middle class white guys from Ivy League schools trying to work in a country that was African American, African, black country, and they were trying to impose their will on a country that didn't understand who they were, what they were all about. So the stereotypical issues certainly arose.
Didn't you have in-country support
Oh,
for
sure,
your teams
sure.
that would have taught you the ins and outs of the?
Yes, of course,
Okay.
but sometimes that was not internalized. I found it difficult, I'm just gonna say this, I found it difficult to run many of these teams. As it was called in the USAID jargon, I was the chief of party, I was the head of the program. And we would be assigned either people from our subcontractors or just other outside consultants. Trying to put that blend together was oftentimes difficult. And again, you've got highly educated folks working as these consultants with their own stereotypes and their own desires and their own whims. And trying to keep these teams together was extraordinarily, I thought, sometimes difficult. I found that in the case of Central and Eastern Europe and in the Middle East. But that's a lot of hard work. So my own argument is that no country's an island economically, in the way that countries engage with the real world key determinant of their development outcomes. I'm just saying that the integration of the world today, just economic flows in terms of health, gender, identity, other opportunities require an increasing sophistication and policy capability. And dealing with policies and procedures in all of these countries requires a really sophisticated level of analysis, and it's getting more so. Over the past 75 years, really since the Truman administration, since his second inaugural, when he spoke about development, the ideas about responsibility of development have clearly shifted. There was a patronizing view in the past that poor countries were incapable of development on their own, and they needed our help from the rich, powerful countries. And I think the view now is that the countries themselves have a primary responsibility over their own development and outcomes, and that development really cannot be imposed from the outside.
Bruce, isn't that really hard to sell to the sponsors?
Yeah, very hard. The idea is that we know best. Many on the right dislike foreign aid, insisting that money should be spent here at home. If you look at Kevin McCarthy's review of President Biden's foreign aid budget, he's reduced the aid budget by 35%. He doesn't see the need for it, and in a speech the other day said, we need to keep that money at home. And his argument, the argument on the right by many, is that the market is more efficient to alleviate poverty and that we really don't need any development aid, and the market will take care of it. Many conservatives, some conservatives, see aid as charity. It's wielded as a weapon to further politicize the aims of the left, so that left-right divide continues. The principal beneficiary of foreign assistance has always been the United States. Roughly 80% of the USAID contracts and grants go directly to American firms, particularly here in Washington. In the Boston-Washington corridor, Boston, New York, and Washington, I'd say it's closer to 90%. The big consulting firms, such as I worked for, Deloitte, just hundreds of millions of dollars of contracts every year, and it really has become its own industry. Aid has created many new markets for American industrial exports and means hundreds of thousands of jobs for the United States. Now, I talked about many on the right, but I believe that many on the left praise aid as a means of redistributing global wealth, helping those less fortunate and having them increase their participation in social, economic, and government is important for the world in general. But the debate continues. Can we, as a wealthy society, continue to influence the social and economic activities of the developing world? And the question that's being asked, and we'll see it in the next election, is, should we be doing this? What is our role in the world in terms of development? My view personally is that the international community can still exercise profound positive or negative impacts on development. It has to do with the quality and the quantity of aid being delivered, and also the aid's alignment with the national objectives of the recipients certainly plays a vital role in contributing to development outcomes. The Biden administration sees aid as ending extreme poverty in his last budget. This was a statement from him: advancing human rights, promoting resilient democratic societies, and advancing global security. So what's it taught me? This work has made me pretty humble, I think. Franklin Roosevelt said, working in the developing world makes one modest. You see what a tiny place you occupy in this world. Again, it made me realize that we share common values, many common wants, needs, and desires. And really realized as a child of the post-World War suburbs how little I knew about the world. And at the end, it really helped me realize who I am as a human being. And I'm forever grateful for the work I've done and for the opportunity I was given. Thank you.
One of the basic weaknesses, I think, in the idea of studying democracy in societies, cultures that have no concept of what that really means and how to implement it. And when they do, they fall under the sway of some would-be dictator because that's so, the easy thing to do. And I thought we learned our lesson many times over, but apparently not.
Yeah, apparently not. I still think there's good in what we're doing. And again, it's a balancing act. And it will continue. Bob, by the way, this is a gentleman who has also done this work.
Maybe two comments. One, picking up a small and a big comment. One is, it was a very good presentation, by the way. You start out by talking about you met at Camp Dula in Boston. And I think that one of the things I've learned going around the world is the benefit of having so many of these political leaders from, educating the United States. And we lost that in the last administration big time. And I have wonderful stories about that. The other thing I think one can learn is there are an awful lot of folks out there that don't want it to work. And Somalia, the Ethiopians don't want it to work. Middle East, I'm sorry, Israel doesn't want it to work. Iran doesn't want it to work. I've been working in Libya. Russia does not want it to work. The Wagner Group is in Russia, for God's sakes. And then we see Ukraine. So, and the politics of oil is endless. So,
In the politics of water.
and the politics of water, yeah, look at Yemen.
Oh, I'm wondering.
Look at Yemen, the Saudi Arabia. Right? So, I think a really big problem is that when you look at that refugee camp, there's just a lot of people that don't want to solve this problem. And I think that I'll give a coup to the United States, the EU. I think they've got the right, I think they're trying to do the right thing.
Trying to do it. Yes.
Could you say something about the competition between the Russians, the Chinese, and the Western world, being us and European Union, and how does that play out in the field?
That's a really hard question. It's worth several books.
Do you have
I see it playing out in Africa right now. Say the Democratic Republic of Congo, that basically is now a Chinese. The U.S. has been there for generations, and now the Chinese are moving in and taking the molybdenum, taking all the natural resources, and the conflict, that conflict clearly is, I'll say it's representational of what I think is happening. The Chinese are basically moving into Africa in mass. And when you go to capitals in Africa, planes filled with Chinese moving in. I don't know how else to explain the problem, except it's going to be a continuation and it's going to be horrific. And
Horrific too for.
they need, the Chinese need resources.
Right.
With their population, and they have turned to Africa, and I will use that as a case in point. Yes.
Part of the problem with evaluating whether these are effective or not is that we have no way of knowing the preventive value. In other words, a lot of people are complaining about the $40 billion we're spending in Ukraine right now.
Yeah.
But we were spending 115 billion when we were in charge of it and running in Afghanistan. And what did we get out of that? So if we can prevent this turning into this kind of war, that really saves us a lot. The Marshall Plan was probably the best example of that.
It was the best.
Where we invested money in Europe and we have reaped 10 times, 100 times over what we ever invested in increased business.
And I would say that the work that was done after the fall of communism in Central and Eastern Europe by the US and the EU,
Right.
smaller Marshall Plan in terms of dollar value.
Right.
But what we've gotten out of that has been tremendous.
Right.
And as I said, that figure just slays me, that 11 of the countries that we provided aid to are now producing aid themselves for others.
Right, because we don't.
They are no longer recipients of aid.
Right, we don't make the distinction between an expense and an investment.
Correct.
You know, because what
Long-term
Purdy
investment.
is investment.
It was a long-term investment in Central and Eastern Europe, I would argue.
This is a very delicate question. Do you think we have enough intellectual horsepower in Washington DC and in the European Union?
Oh, my God. You asked the toughest question. I
Well,
don't know about you.
And Hans what he thinks.
Intellectual horsepower?
because that's what it all comes down to. You know,
Much of the horsepower is not in the political system, it's in the private sector.
We can get our egos out of the way.
Yeah.
so you're suggesting that our capitalistic free enterprise system is going to produce more intellectual horsepower than either the Chinese or the Russians can.
I don't know if I have an answer for that.
More than Russia.
But the intellectual horsepower today is found in the private sector.
Okay, well, that's,
And that's
I'm glad to hear.
Not, I would argue, I mean, not in the political culture.
I'm gonna rescue you from that question. It's a little bit of a turn, but speaking of the Marshall Plan, do you have, can you speculate whether any of these organizations are talking about how Ukraine is going to be rebuilt at some point when it's
Constantly.
safe to rebuild? It's going to be huge.
Constantly. It's going to be huge. It's going to be another Marshall Plan.
Yeah.
In some respects, U.S. Samantha Powers, who is the current head of the USAID, is focusing many of her priorities and much of her time on figuring out next steps and working with her counterparts because she knows USAID just doesn't have the resources or the money, but we have to, tie into the IMF, World Bank, whatever, EU, Japanese funds, DFID, all the various aid organizations around the world, and together form a consortium to go after. But the question is, when will it end, and how does it end? But Samantha Powers was in the Washington Post this weekend talking about the fact that her priority right now is to figure out what is going to be the humanitarian aid that is required on their part and who they should be forming this consortium with to create the climate for future aid and development to the country, non-military aid.
I have another, I'm going to make this an easy one.
You are difficult.
If you had to go over it again, are you, in the work that you did for 44 years, you said,
Yeah,
did you see enough success that if you had to start over again, you would do it?
in a heartbeat.
That's as occurred.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean,
Don't say heartbeat.
Heartbeat, yeah, heartbeat. The King's Hospital in Jordan. Yeah, I love the work. I found it, my first trip to Beirut, I think I was talking about that, I was 24. I mean, I was a kid, hadn't been to, I grew up in Boston, I hadn't been west of Worcester. I loved it. I mean, but frustrating, oh my God. The time, the energy, Bob can attest to this. The contracts, the negotiations, the competition among firms. I mean, it was cutthroat. But I managed to survive. So, anything else? Thank you.
Thank you.